Once Italy joined the war, the Italian and Austro-Hungarian navies faced each other across the Adriatic Sea in a deadlock. The Italian navy was superior in numbers and quality, but the Albanian and Dalmatian coastal harbours were better fortified and easier to defend. Both sides concentrated their strategies on fast torpedo and gunboat battles. Highly mobile and able to threaten either navy attempting to leave harbour, they inflicted heavy damage using these raider tactics. Italy developed the MAS, the anti-submarine motorboat. Made of plywood and only useful in calm water, they were still faster than any other warship and carried depth charges, torpedoes and mines. Submarines harassed unwary steamers, and seaplanes and torpedo boats harassed submarines. There were coastal raids back and forth on both sides, but it was the Allied naval blockade of the Adriatic that perhaps had the strongest effect on this front. It effectively halted Austrian shipping and prevented them from adequately resupplying their empire, which exacerbated their food and material crisis as the war dragged on. Monte Grappa occupied a strategic position on the Assaggio Plateau, overlooking the gateway of the plains of Veneto. Whoever controlled its height controlled the area, and it saw its share of battles during the war. In 1917, the Italians halted the Austrian summer offensive at the very peak, and by December, the Austrians had been pushed off the mountain. Further attempts to take the mountain in the spring and summer of 1918 also failed, and Monte Grappa, by then the symbol for Italy's defense, would play a huge part in the final Italian offensive of the war on Vittorio Veneto. Brutal fighting finally forced the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian army and its retreat in late October 1918. Two-thirds of the casualties of the offensive were inflicted around Monte Grappa itself. With Russia out of the war, Germany was free to transfer hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened troops to the Western Front to try to break the stalemate there and hope to win the war through a decisive final victory. The Americans had not yet arrived in force, and the British and French were exhausted from the battles of 1917. It was time to strike. Operation Michael would be the first battle of the new offensive. The plan was to punch through the British Fifth Army and outflank the Third near the endless, devastated no-man's zone of St. Quentin, with the aim of finally capturing the vital Allied railway hub of Amiens. This was to be the mother of all battles. It began with 1 million artillery shells raining down on the British in 5 hours. Headquarters, communications and artillery were destroyed. Following the surprise and terror, German stormtroopers overwhelmed the British defences, ripping a gap over 60 kilometres long in their lines. This was only the beginning of the Kaiserschlacht. The importance of the Suez Canal to the British in the war cannot be overstated. Having millions of troops from India, Australia and New Zealand heading to Egypt and Europe, and also British oil from Persia being shipped through the canal, it was a vital supply line. If captured by the Ottoman Empire, it would severely disrupt British troop and supply routes and put the entire Eastern Mediterranean in Ottoman hands. In early 1915, they crossed the Sinai Desert to attack the canal. This near impossible accomplishment was enabled by German engineers going in advance to dig water wells through the desert. When the Ottomans reached the canal, they knew they only had 4 days to seize it before running out of supplies. Ottoman artillery would be vital for the attack to have any chance of success. And diversionary attacks all along the canal would be launched in the hopes of confusing the defenders. The Ottomans would attack the Suez Canal several times during the war, but never took it. The British counterattacked and pushed the Ottomans back into the Sinai Desert. When the modern combustion engine was first developed in the 1880s, few realized how much it would change the global economy. But over the next decades, in every shipyard, it became obvious that oil power was superior to coal in every way. A motor could now reach full power in 30 minutes instead of 6 hours. It required a fraction of the men to run it, and a ship's range increased fourfold. Even before the war, the dreadnoughts of the mighty British Navy had begun to convert to oil power, but oil was to be found far from British shores. Much of the British war effort in the Middle East was to protect British oil supplies, the Suez Canal transport route, and to take or destroy the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, Germany's oil supply line to the Ottoman Empire. As the war progressed, and the airplane, the car, the submarine, and the tank were produced in greater and greater numbers, oil became ever more important. The Battle of Caporetto in October 1917 nearly broke Italy. They took 300,000 casualties as German and Austro-Hungarian forces crashed into the Isonzo River Valley. 1 year later, the situation was different. The German army was in retreat, Bulgaria had surrendered, the Entente was pushing through the Balkans and the Middle East, and the Italian Army Chief of Staff had been sacked for his incompetence and replaced by Armando Diaz. Austria-Hungary was on the verge of collapse, and if Italy was to gain any territory, they would have to act swiftly before the war ended. Diaz launched a final offensive to capture Vittorio Veneto. The fighting was brutal, but eventually the combined Entente forces had the demoralized Austrians in full retreat. They took Trent and Trieste as the Habsburgs' empire began to collapse. The Armistice of Villa Giusti took effect on November 4, 1918, and ended warfare on the Italian front, 4 days after the end of the last bloody battle of the Great War. The Allies' 100 days offensive began with the Battle of Amiens. Their objective was to capture the vital railway hub at Sedan, beside the Meuse River. This location was vital for the German army to move supplies and support to its forces north of Verdun. The job of taking Sedan fell to the fresh American troops under the command of General Blackjack Pershing, and to the French. They would supply artillery, tanks, and air support. The Germans held on grimly, but with their reserves dwindling, they had no choice but to withdraw. By November 5th, Allied artillery was within range of the railway lines. With 1.2 million American soldiers involved, the Meuse-Argonne offensive is to this day the largest battle in the United States military history. Though a success, it was enormously costly. The fighting in the heavily fortified terrain of the Argonne forest has been described as hell on earth, and for the Americans, it was the bloodiest battle of the war. The German Spring Offensive, also known as the Kaiserschlacht, was a series of German attacks on the Western Front in the spring of 1918. Germany had a manpower advantage over the Allies since Russia had left the war following the revolution. But German High Command realized that this would disappear as millions of troops began arriving from the USA. If Germany were to win the war, they needed to strike immediately and strike hard. German stormtroops would lead the attack. This was the first use of German tanks and an artillery bombardment so massive it could be heard in London. The Germans broke through the Allied lines, advancing further than anyone had in the West since 1914. But as the weeks went on, they were unable to move supplies and reinforcements forward quickly enough to continue the advance. Though they had made great gains and inflicted devastating casualties on the enemy, they did not achieve final victory, and the German army was left exhausted and depleted.